Hello, and welcome to Chartergates' sponsored webinar on mitigating the risk in your supply chain, with particular focus on upcoming changes to umbrella company legislation and their impact on the construction industry. I'm Danielle Keneally, a journalist at Construction Wave, and I'm joined today by Mark Taylor and Matt Boddington, both directors, thanks, at Chartergates, and Chartergates are experts in tax, VAT, and employment law. And today we'll be diving into a key legislative update to the Finance Bill 2025 to 2026, coming into effect on the 6th of April this year, and what it means to businesses, workers, and the broader sector, and how companies can navigate these changes. Please, if you have any questions, if you could put them in the chat for later in the webinar, and we'll get to them if we have time at the end. So to begin with, can you both provide an overview of the key elements of the new legislation we'll be focusing on today, which is the umbrella company and labour supply chain regulations and further purported umbrella companies set to come into effect, as I said, on the 6th of April 2026 this year. Specifically, how will the changes to tax, VAT and employment law impact construction industry stakeholders, including contractors, workers, and businesses? And what are the main drivers behind this legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. Shall I get started, Mark?
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks, Danielle. Just a couple of bits of sort of housekeeping, I guess, around the legislation. It is, as you say, set to come in on the 6th of April 2026. Having said that, that's not too far away, but it's still very much in draft, still working its way through the usual legislative procedure, and we have seen a few little changes to it. Nothing major that sort of impacts what we're going to discuss today, more around the practicalities, but got to bear in mind, and this has happened in the past, 11th hour changes are possible. So we're keeping a watching brief on what happens there. But we've got a draft. We've been studying it for the last few weeks to understand all the implications. It's quite nuanced, it's quite complicated. So we'll keep the pace sensible. We might need to dig into a bit of detail at some points, but we'll try and make it as digestible as possible. But apologies in advance for anything too technical. I think the other bit of housekeeping is to talk about terminology. Everybody's heard of umbrella companies, and there are a lot of different words that are used to describe entities in construction and outside. We've got PEOs, umbrella companies, employer of record, intermediaries, commercial contractors. We've got to forget all of that, and we've got to look at the definitions that apply in the legislation. And that's really important to remember, because people can be described as all sorts of different things. But the key is, do you meet the tests in this legislation? And there are some surprising outcomes when you apply it strictly. So with that said, I'm just going to pass over to Mark to talk about probably the easiest, simplest one, traditional umbrella companies.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I think it's probably worth looking at the legislation in two parts. There's the umbrella company section, which, as Matt said, the definition is really important. And then there's a second part, which is the purported umbrella company section, which we'll talk about in a second. So if we just look at the umbrella company section to start with, this is the simplest and easiest part of the legislation to understand. So in reality, what we're looking at here is there is an individual, the worker, that is employed by one party and then supplied to another party in the chain as a consequence of a contract or a series of contracts further up the supply chain. So it's almost your classic, if you could imagine, construction business, employment agency, umbrella company, umbrella employee at the end. That sort of chain. There doesn't have to be two intermediaries, there can just be one, but that's the sort of chain we're looking at where there is an intermediary in between the construction company and the worker at the bottom. If that individual is employed, then they are within the definition of an umbrella company and the umbrella company arrangements, which means that if there's any PAYE owed to HMRC by the umbrella company, whether that's because it hasn't been paid or it's been miscalculated, for example, then the umbrella company is jointly and severally liable, along with what the legislation terms the relevant party. So it's really important that those further up the contractual chain, for example, the construction businesses at the top end of the chain, understand in what circumstances they might be the relevant party. So obviously the details important here, as are specific circumstances, but generally speaking, the relevant party, so the party that is jointly and severally liable with the umbrella company, will be the end client if they have a contract direct with the umbrella company. But if it's not the end client, then it will be the business in the supply chain that has a contract with the end client. So for example, if we have a 3-tier supply chain, so we've got end client, umbrella company, worker. In that scenario, if there's PAYE due, it will be the umbrella company and the end client that are jointly and severally liable. If we take the chain out one step further, so we've got end client, employment agency, umbrella company, individual, then it will be the umbrella company and the employment agency that are jointly and severally liable, and the end client won't be one of the liable parties. So the key with this part, the simpler part of the legislation, is to remember this is geared at scenarios where all the parties accept that the individual is employed and that PAYE is due. So in terms of scenarios where someone could be jointly or severally liable for PAYE, we're looking at probably the most dangerous is umbrella company business failure. So they just go bust without paying PAYE to the individuals. And then the party further up the chain will be the liable party. But also scenarios where the PAYE is not calculated correctly. Perhaps there's been a mistake in the hourly rate. We see that a lot in employment tribunals. Maybe the umbrella company hasn't dealt with their margin correctly, and HMRC are able to argue that's part of the rate. At which point we've got a scenario where there's PAYE due, and if the umbrella company, for whatever reason, chooses not to pay it, or even if they want to pay it, but HMRC decides to go further up the chain, then someone else will be jointly and severally liable for that amount as well. So it's simpler in the sense of there's no contention that PAYE is due. It's just a case of HMRC has somewhere else to go if the PAYE due isn't paid. And did you want to touch on purported umbrella companies, Matt?
Yes, I'll move on to that. Just one thing on what Mark was saying there. There are some special rules in labour supply that deem people to be PAYE, to deem people to be employed, that apply generally to agencies. But when Mark says employment, it's the true meaning of employment. You have to actually be employed under a contract of service, a contract of employment, for those specific rules to apply. There are other rules, as Mark says, that we'll come on to momentarily, but that particular, the sort of what we might call the vanilla umbrella company rule, they have to be actual employees for that to apply and for joint and several liability to kick in. So yes, that's the easy bit, as Mark said. So, but buckle up, because now it gets a little bit down the rabbit hole.
Hospital pass to Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks that. Yeah, thanks that.
So yeah, having that poison chalice in my hand now, let's move on to the bit of the legislation that isn't really being talked about, surprisingly, because we think it's the trickier part, the part that's likely to create more liabilities, particularly in construction, where there's quite a lot of self-employed people, there's a big self-employed population, and this area of the legislation is targeted more at that. So we have something now. This was a change just before Christmas to the legislation, and that's why I say we've got to be careful that until it's in, it's not in. They've come up with 3 different ways you can be what's been described as a purported umbrella company. This is a whole new type of definition. They're called Case 1, Case 2, and Case 3. So I'm going to refer to them in that way because it's quite a handy breakdown, and you need to understand all of them. They're all slightly different and nuanced to apply the legislation properly. So starting with Case 1, I'm going to have to simplify a bit because it's just hideously complicated. But the general proposition here is, if somebody at the top of the supply chain, so it could be the client, it could technically, in some circumstances, be the agency, but it's very, very unlikely here. we're talking about right at the top of the supply chain, thinks that the worker is an employee, but it actually turns out they're not, that creates what they're calling a purported umbrella company, case one purported umbrella company. So the client thinks there's employment, but the engaging entity at the bottom of the labour supply chain is actually engaging people on a self-employed basis, then it's a purported umbrella company and that individual is deemed to be PAYE. I mean, this is massive for obvious reasons here. Unlike the scenario Mark's talking about where there's a liability if an umbrella company folds because it can't pay its tax and NIC, or there's a technical error, at least, PAYE is being operated in an umbrella company because the individuals are employees. But this is a situation where PAYE isn't currently being operated and the individuals suddenly become deemed employees and PAYE is due on everything that's been paid to them. So if this purported umbrella company test is met and applies, this is going to create a massive liability. And in terms of who's liable, it follows the rules that Mark's just described. So the umbrella company becomes liable, and if there's an agency in the chain, that agency becomes liable, or if the umbrella is direct to the client becomes liable jointly and severally. So it takes a bit of wrapping your head around. It's an entirely new test. The test is very convoluted. It involves the revenue reasonably assuming that somebody at the client would suppose the worker was an employee. So it's a sort of double-legged test. There's going to have to be case law to wrangle out how it will actually be applied in practice. But you asked about the purpose of this legislation, Danielle, and clearly the purpose here is where the client thinks it's employment, it is employment. It's as simple as that. And I think one of the reasons behind this, we've seen news reports over the last year or two, where particularly from government emanating contracts, there's been, say, a diktat in the contract to say everyone's got to be an employee. And then by the time you get down the supply chain, it may be 3 or 4 parties removed from the contract. Individuals are being engaged on a self-employed basis and nobody at the client knows about it. Well, the test now is if the client says employment and the client would suppose they're employees, they are employees, with all the consequences that flow from that. So that's what they call case one purported umbrella companies. And then we've got case two, which is a not dissimilar but slightly different scenario. That's where you've got the sort of shortened supply chain of client dealing directly with an intermediary company, engaging workers on a self-employed basis. In that scenario, there are some special rules we were discussing a moment ago for intermediaries supplying to a client where they have to operate PAYE, and the rule says you have to operate PAYE unless you can show there's no supervision, direction or control over the manner of the work, the SDC test as it's more commonly known. So in that supply chain, there's a client, there's an intermediary, and then a self-employed worker. Under the existing rules, the intermediary would be responsible for showing there's no SDC, and if they can't do that, everybody has to be PAYE, taxes due on the lot, tax and NIC. Under this case two purported umbrella, what the legislation will say from April is not only is that intermediary liable for the PAYE, but the client is also jointly and severally liable. So it's not introducing a new test. It's not converting people to PAYE. PAYE would be due anyway if you fail that test. It's just at the moment, it's the engaging intermediary that's liable. From April, the client is, very, very much got skin in the game. We'll talk about the practicalities of that maybe a bit later on in the seminar, because there's certain things that everybody's going to need to focus on and do. But that's the test for now. Case three, the final one, still relevant, maybe slightly less relevant to construction, but you certainly see this. This is a specific case for personal service companies. It's kind of similar to the case one test, whereby if you think there's an employment, same kind of idea. But if somebody at the top of the supply chain thinks that money is going through as salary to the individual, but it turns out they're running their own PSC and taking the money out as dividends. So it might be a case, for example, where the client has said IR35 applies, issued a status determination statement, as it's called in the world of IR35, and sent it down the supply chain to say you've got to operate PAYE. So if the client thinks PAYE is being operated and it turns out it's not, or is not being operated on at least a substantial proportion of the money going to the individual, same as case one, it's all deemed to be PAYE. Does that make sense? I know
Yes, thank you.
there's a lot to absorb there. There's a lot of detail. These are entirely new tests. I don't think there's anything like these sort of tests where someone thinks something and therefore it happens in any other part of the legislation that I'm aware of. But yeah, that's how it breaks down. The purpose of it all is to shine a light on the supply chain. Because as far as the revenue are concerned, rightly or wrongly, there's too many situations where the client's thinking one thing. By the time you get to the end of the supply chain and the revenue say, it's a bit murky down there, all sorts of things could be going on with offshore schemes or loan schemes or tax avoidance or self-employment when it's supposed to be PAYE. Well, now it doesn't really matter what you're doing. If the client thinks it's PAYE or IR35 applies, then it does, and the tax is due, and there's joint and several liability working its way back up the supply chain again.
And these test cases themselves, who is considering which case it'll be? Is it the HMRC, or who would it be exactly?
So I think if you're a construction business reviewing your supply chain, you've got to consider all these tests, these cases in terms of what due diligence you do. But after that, it will be HMRC starting an inquiry, gathering the facts, and then deciding which one of the cases they believe applies. And there's nothing in the legislation that doesn't say they can't run more than one case at the same time.
Okay.
Because I suppose, there might be, because we're dealing in the world now of reasonable suppositions and assumptions, it's not hard to see where there could be more than one different reasonable assumption in the supply chain that applies. And I think that's really important to understand the distinctions between case one and case two. Case two still requires that supervision directional control test. So there is still a status test. So HMRC will still need to gather the evidence, and you'll need to show there's no supervision directional control. With case one, there is no status test anymore. This is just, is there a reasonable supposition that someone further up the chain assumed the individual was an employee? If that test is met, there's no, okay, so now we need to work out whether they are actually employees or not. That's it. There's no status test anymore. It is purely that income should have been PAYE and the employer's national insurance is due. So it's hugely important that end clients, construction businesses, everyone in the supply chain understands those tests and understands how to mitigate what they're doing because of those tests now. And this whole legislation really is all about illuminating the supply chain, making sure that everyone in the supply chain from top to bottom understands the nature of the engagements, agrees that these are how the engagements should be operated, and then ensures that that is what is happening in practice. So it's particularly important in the construction sector where there's a large self-employed population, and understandably so. The nature of construction fits with that. So it's just about construction businesses now understanding what they need to do to satisfy these tests because they're completely new. And probably the only other thing to say on this right now is this is about PAYE, and for self-employed people, the employer's national insurance. There's no direct VAT or employment law consequences. So employment law, for example, is a separate jurisdiction. So if one of these purported umbrella company tests applied, it doesn't automatically turn all the self-employed people as employees of the intermediary. That would have to be in an employment tribunal. It doesn't mean that a judgment on either side can't play a part. I mean, for example, now if an individual took an employment tribunal claim, a self-employed subcontractor, let's say, and said they believed they were actually an employee, and a tribunal found that, that might be the starting pistol for HMRC to say, oh, well, maybe this is a case one scenario, maybe it's a case two scenario. So it's important everything's on all fours and all the jurisdictions are considered, but it's also important to remember that this particular legislation is just applicable to the tax jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate both your answers there. And with this new joint and several liabilities and those what you've mentioned with the PAYE and also NIC obligations, and the new responsibilities that they will face with those, and the government's projection, indicates about £75 million in revenue in the first year, which is going to rise to about £895 million by 27, as a result of the improved tax compliance. So it is clear that the financial stakes are pretty high. How do you see this affecting payroll systems then, and recruitment practices and business operations in the sector? Should businesses expect any changes to how umbrella companies manage tax and VAT, and how can they best prepare for it?
I think yes. I think probably if you are a business that uses umbrella companies or uses temporary labour whatever source it comes from, I think you should be expecting your suppliers to be coming to you and at the very least be able to sit down and discuss the legislation with you and how it applies to your business. I say it like that because I think there's a sense in the marketplace that someone will they'll come along, your supplier will come along and say, this is the solution, that's how you deal with it, and we'll put that in place for you, and that's fine. As we've just outlined with all these different purported umbrella cases, they are fact specific, and so having a one size fits all solution won't work in these circumstances. We're in the world now of reasonable suppositions and assumptions, and so what I'd be expecting if I was a client is my umbrella company to be sitting down and saying, this is how the legislation applies to you, and this is how we can deal with it. I think also, though, the biggest change here in terms of operating practices and in terms of due diligence and changes has to be at the top of the supply chain, because that's where this legislation is targeted. So for a while, and I think this is what the legislation has picked up on, it's been relatively easy for someone at the top of the chain to delegate this down, to say, well, we use an agency, they use an umbrella company, it's all on them, so it's up to them to satisfy this. The legislation recognises that and says, yeah, and so we're going to place the liability further up the chain, which means those that are now potentially liable need to take responsibility for this as well, because a lot of this information, things like supervision, direction or control, or whether there's an assumption that someone up the chain believes there's an employment, that all comes from further up the chain. So businesses further up the chain, construction companies using labour supply companies, they need to analyse this themselves and work collaboratively with their suppliers, because there's a certain amount the supplier can do, but a lot of this information needed is housed further up the chain, and it's about those businesses understanding that, addressing their contracts, addressing their documents, addressing how they communicate, and then working with their suppliers to make sure everyone's as compliant as possible.
Okay, thank you. It kind of leads us on quite nicely to the next question, because as you've just mentioned, one of the key aspects of this legislation is the requirement for agencies and end clients to actively monitor their supply chains and to ensure compliance. With the change aiming to reduce the number of non-compliant umbrella companies that could otherwise undermine the integrity of the sector.
Yeah.
What steps should companies take to ensure that they are working with compliant umbrella companies, and how can they effectively assess and manage the risk of non-compliance within their supply chain?
Yeah, I mean that's really the key question here, isn't it? And by the way, to go back to your figures, we've become cynical about the government estimating how much money it's going to over the years. I remember 400 million being the number for IR35, and it brought in about 150,000, I think, one of the years. But anyway, leaving that aside, they've got a hole to fill in the
Yeah.
spreadsheet, and they've got to fill it somehow. It's definitely going to be the case. I think there'll be voluntary compliance in that first year. Obviously, PAYE liabilities they take a bit of time to build up, and they don't generally get assessed until the end of the year. So that's why there's the
Yeah.
smaller number year one. But yeah, it's going to have a big effect for sure. What can clients do? What should clients do? The first thing to build on what Mark was saying is got to understand your supply chains. It has been possible to an extent to sort of shrug your shoulders and think, well, that's all happening somewhere else out of my control. I can just use this agency. It doesn't really matter what's going on. But the purpose of this legislation is to, as I say, shine a light right across the supply chain. Everyone has to know what's happening. I think when we've done this with a few clients already, you've almost got to build up a sort of map of all your engagements. And it's amazing when you start to sort of turn over stones what you find. You've got the client, they're going to be having potentially direct engaged people, employees, maybe some PSC contractors, maybe using an agency, maybe using a bank of agencies, maybe using a subcontractor using an agency that's supplying labour into them. Those agencies might be using umbrella companies or self-employed intermediaries, and it's like an exponential increase, Danielle. When you start doing this, and you start with a bit of A4 paper and you end up with a bit of A2 and no space left. But this is really important. You need to understand what's happening right through your labour supply chain. Only when you've done that and when you understand how this legislation works, can you start spotting where risks are and saying, well, okay, look, there's a risk of a case one scenario here, there's a risk of a case two, that's an umbrella company, I'm jointly and severally liable. I mean, this is obviously not just for clients, this is for agencies as well. I'm sure you've got many construction agencies attending today. And really important to know what's going on right through the supply chain, because not until you've done that, you can't really identify where your risk areas are. Once you've done that, you look really carefully at the contracts that are in place. Because of these slightly woolly tests, you only need one offending clause in a client contract saying everyone's an employee to potentially cause real problems. £875 million is a big number, but it stacks up very, very quickly when you got a couple of hundred self-employed individuals for an intermediary. If they suddenly get converted to PAYE, and there's in a few years' time the revenue are looking back, they can go easily up to 4 years, usually 6 years. They only need to establish a lack of reasonable care. Those liabilities mount very, very quickly indeed, and we've had hundreds of millions of pounds of liability on some of the cases we've worked over the years. So this is a big risk in magnitude. It needs to be mitigated. So yeah, once you've done that exercise of understanding your supply chains, then we've got to look at the contractual arrangements that are in place. The obvious answer of auditing umbrellas and suppliers to make sure that what they are doing, what they say they are doing, is what they're actually doing, is key to this. That's one of the changes I think we'll see. Audits both ways in the supply chain are going to be much more prevalent, and everybody needs to be facing the same direction. I mean, let's get this out of the way now. This legislation isn't a problem if everybody does the right thing, and if the contracts say the right thing, if the communication is right, if everybody understands what's going on. Yes, this is a new, scary and complicated bit of legislation, but it is definitely navigable with the right contracts and the right advice. But yeah, no more blind eye being turned to what's going on. It needs to be clear what's going on. Everybody needs to understand, and all the contracts communications through that supply chain need to be consistent. That's the important thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you've previously mentioned, I think both of you have the fraudulent companies are a significant issue in the construction sector, and they're often facilitating tax avoidance and other illegal activities. So the new legislation will aim to crack down on these operators by increasing the responsibility, especially with these audits, which will become more prevalent and increase that responsibility of those who use umbrella companies in their supply chains. How do you think the new rules will affect the purported umbrella companies in the industry, and what steps can businesses and agencies and end clients take to protect themselves from engaging with fraudulent umbrella companies?
Yeah, I think the first thing here to perhaps understand is this legislation is so wide, it doesn't require fraud. So it doesn't require someone further down the supply chain to be lying to someone further up the supply chain about what's going on. All it requires to buy is a reasonable supposition that someone would assume that. So yeah, it could be as low as everyone knows they're self-employed, but there's some contracts there that say you've got to employ them. That would be enough for HMRC to do this test. So while the legislation is very much publicised on the basis of guarding against fraud, and that's clearly part of this, HMRC have taken the route of going well beyond fraudulent conduct falling within this. So I think probably the first thing, going back to what Matt said, was if construction companies set out an engagement map, all the ways they receive labour, whether that's directly or via third parties, that will then probably give them a good idea of where they sit with the purported umbrella company rules as a starting point, because it's been surprising how many end clients we've spoken to so far don't have a great handle on where all their labour's coming from and how it's engaged. So if you start plotting out your engagement map and you get to, we've got an agency, we've got an umbrella company, but we have no idea what's going on beyond that, doesn't mean anyone's telling us something fraudulent, just means we haven't bothered checking, then you are squarely within potentially the purported umbrella company rules. And that's where steps need to be taken. First and foremost, getting clarity on everything that's happening through the chain. And if we go back to engaging with good umbrellas, they should have absolutely no problem coming to you with that clarity and saying, this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. After you've done that and you've got that information, it's about deciding, well, are we happy with all those engagements? Are they what we want? If they are, then it's about going back to the contracts, making sure they reflect what's happening and what you want, but also then, as we've said, auditing these. And I think it's really important we businesses, particularly end clients and construction businesses, understand we're talking about more than just auditing the bottom line. What's the bottom line at the end of the pay slip or the remittance advice, and has that been paid to HMRC? Hopefully, we've been able today to show that there are significantly more factors that can create problems here, particularly with regards to the purported umbrella company rules. So any audits need to go beyond just, has the payslip been calculated correctly? It's got to be looking at the contracts, it's got to be ensuring that all the communications are in line, and it's got to be ensuring that those up the chain are keeping their side of the bargain as well. So yeah, really, collaboration is important because there's a common interest for everyone in the chain to make sure it's all working how they want it to.
Okay, thank you. So like you've just mentioned, while it's the government has spoken about the fraudulent activity, it is more about the oversight and a better handle on their employment and how people are employed. I appreciate that. Thank you. So under these new rules, and agencies and clients may face significant liabilities if umbrella companies fail to meet the PAYE and the NIC contributions obligations. What are the potential legal and financial risks for construction businesses, and what specific repercussions do agencies and clients face if they're found in breach of these new joint liability provisions?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. Joint and several liability does what it says on the tin, and as I think Mark alluded to earlier, doesn't necessarily mean that the revenue have to try and go and get the money from the umbrella company first. Joint and several means you are equally liable by default for the whole lot. And we know when someone's trying to get money, they look at where the money is before they start pursuing it. So far be it from me to cast aspersions over HMRC, but I think they're probably going to be hitting agencies who are dealing with umbrella companies quite hard if it turns out those umbrella companies do fold, and it does happen. Any business can fail. No business is immune. Like Mark says, it doesn't have to be fraud, or even something less pernicious. And quite often, draconian rules can come in off the back of what is perceived to be, something quite nasty like fraud. But when you look at the detail of the rules, they're much, much wider, and this is definitely the case. Mark talked about technical errors earlier. Those are equally part of the equation here, and probably almost a bigger risk, particularly in the straightforward umbrella company scenario. There's at least PAYE is being operated on most of the payments, but umbrella companies do get tax bills from time to time. If it's a big enough bill to put them under, the client or the agency that they're dealing with is now going to be very much on the hook. To be honest, other than making sure that you are dealing with a compliant party, by way of the things we've discussed, audits, there's not a lot else you can do. Obviously, we will see indemnity clauses starting to fly both ways, I'm sure, in contracts, because people are going to be worried about liabilities and they'll be seeking ways to insulate themselves from them. But one of the problems with this legislation is it's more likely to kick in a situation where somebody can't pay their tax bill. And if that's the case, if you can't pay your tax bill, you can't pay an indemnity clause either. So they might keep people on their toes, shall we say, but they are of limited efficacy when it comes to protecting yourself here. I think the answer, in short, is compliance. If you do the right things, if everybody knows what's happening and everybody does the right thing in that supply chain, then we can avoid problems. So it is about understanding the law. It's about understanding your supply chain. Might be a bit of education involved as well, because I'm sure this is going to take a bit of time to filter through not just the industry, but people's grey matter, because it's very, very complicated and there's so much going on day to day to get to grips with. This might not bubble to the top of the list for a while. But yeah, really, really important to wrap your head around it and potentially educate your clients and your suppliers about what's coming in and say, look, we've all got to be consistent and get this right now, because it's where there's those wrinkles that problems can occur. So yeah, we've got to be on top of it from April.
Definitely. Well, there is a potential that it could change how businesses engage with their workforce, and there is, particularly regarding worker classification rights. And there is an estimated 700,000 individuals who are currently working through umbrella companies. How do you foresee these changes affecting employment practices in the sector? How will the legislation protect workers, especially those exposed to unexpected tax liabilities, and reduce the risk of financial issues caused by non-compliant umbrella companies, or even those technical errors, as you've mentioned?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest change here will be businesses ensuring they know what's happening in their supply chains. I think that's the biggest thing. I think in terms of the worker, like much tax legislation, this doesn't confer any employment rights on them at all. So let's say, case one, purported umbrella, HMRC are able to show the assumptions we were talking about, the assumed employment, and convert all that CIS income into PAYE and employers' national insurance. Doesn't make the workers employees. What they'll have to do, and this might be a byproduct of the legislation, is they'll have to assert their case at the employment tribunal. So they'll have to go to the employment tribunal and say, well, look, HMRC believe I'm an employee, so I should be an employee. Now, historically, the tests are similar, but it's never been enough either way to shift the dial. So someone being an employee in the employment tribunal on its own doesn't make them an employee for tax and vice versa. But what we might see is more tribunal claims because of HMRC activity. But in and of itself, the legislation doesn't do much for the individual, despite the rhetoric that it's there to help protect the individuals. This is about tax take. What we're going to see more of is focusing on getting employment status right. So focusing on the SDC test, focusing on getting all the information that's necessary to make an educated judgment on whether someone is self-employed or employed. That's where the focus has got to be, because that is, in the end, everything else, the joint and several liability, all of that fades away if the status is right, the communications are clear, and what's happening in practice is mirrored by the documents. Then there's no joint and several liability to worry about, because there's no liability. So it all comes, there's only joint and several liability if there's a liability in the first place. So if everyone focuses on getting the engagements right, and that might mean some shifting in how some individuals are engaged, but it's more about making sure you're happy with your engagements and they deal with things correctly, then there's no liability to worry about. But there's just more to do now to be happy.
Okay, so
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, do I just add something to that, Danielle, if you don't mind?
yes, I'll go for it.
It's a bit of a sweeping statement, but our experience of doing construction over many, many years is that, generally speaking, site-based construction operatives are happy to be self-employed, want to be self-employed. They're plying their trade and they're happy to move from contractor to contractor. That's a bit of a generalization, but it is an industry where everybody's fairly comfortable with the world of self-employment, workers included. As Mark said, this is PAYE liability, which is the liability of an employer by default. But there's a few gaps in the jigsaw puzzle at the moment. We're not quite sure how it's going to play out. But there are some rules where PAYE liability can be transferred to a worker, Reg 72. So you've got a situation where an employer makes an error in good faith but took reasonable care, then liability can be passed to a worker. Just the tax liability we're talking about now, not the NIC. So it might be the case that we see more of that sort of claim being made, because now the stakes are much bigger. The question mark is, we don't know, and nobody's come from HMRC and told us yet how this all marries together, particularly in a situation where you're not the employer, you're just the jointly and severally liable party. It's unclear whether and to what extent you can argue your case and say, we don't think they're employees, or we don't think there was a supposition of an assumption of employment. There's a lot of detail to be filled in, so it's a little bit unclear at the moment how appeal rights are going to apply to all these potential parties who are now suddenly tangled up in a liability that they didn't have the day before. So that's a complexity to be resolved. There's also the fact, of course, that if you are in construction working on site, you're very likely to be engaged under the CIS rules. So you're going to have paid some tax. Now, there are some special rules they introduced a few years ago that allow an employer, that if they get a liability, to set off that CIS deduction and self-employed tax that's been paid against the PAYE liability. Again, we don't know how that's going to extend to a jointly and severally liable party. We hope that the revenue will say you can still get the set off for CIS. It would seem hideously unfair if they don't, but we've seen plenty of hideously unfair things happen over the years. So we're kind of holding our breath to waiting to see what happens on that. But the underlying point of all of this is, it's such a big shake-up, and it's impossible to say it's all on you. The worker could be fouled up in it, an umbrella company definitely will, an agency could be, a client could be, even if it's by dint of an indemnity clause or just disruption in the supply chain. An umbrella company going bust and taking an agency down with it is not going to be helpful on a Monday morning when you've got 30 people to get onto site. So commercial disruption shouldn't be underestimated either. So just wanted to add those points.
Thank you. On the back of that, is there long-term changes that you expect then within the sector? Could there be stricter, I know we've spoken about compliance, but will there be stricter compliance requirements that lead to a shift towards more direct employment? Or will companies find ways to maintain that use of umbrella companies and under these new rules and ensure they are compliant? And I'm sure, obviously, with these additional audits, that will be the case. But quite interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think there'll be stricter compliance requirements, or there should be, filtering down the chain from construction businesses to their labour suppliers. But I think it's really important that whatever compliance requirements a particular business filters down are based on their circumstances. I think it's really important we avoid, I think I said it earlier, the one size fits all solutions here. Because, to an extent, that's why we are where we are with this legislation, because there's been too much. Don't worry about it. It's happening down there. There's an umbrella company, so that's fine. I think we've got to go beyond that now and look beyond that. In terms of direct employment, I think that's the aim of this. HMRC will be hoping more just go directly employed because of this, but I think, and that might be the right situation for some businesses if they do their due diligence first, but especially in construction, it's why they have the CIS scheme, because self-employment fits with construction. And so to just simply say more people should be employed, you're going to lose labour because they like being self-employed. You're going to be turning working practices that fit self-employment but treating someone as employed, which doesn't really work in practice. And you're going to be incurring significant costs when you don't need to. When what you need to do is incur some costs to ensure everything fits. And if it does, carry on engaging self-employed labour. It's as simple as, the liability can shift now, but if you can satisfy the rules still, then there's no issue with engaging self-employed subcontractors. It's about doing the work now and continuously to ensure you can still engage self-employed subcontractors, especially in construction, where, like I said, there is a need for self-employment, and it is an industry that fits, which is why it's got its own tax scheme for self-employed subcontractors.
And it's worth reiterating Mark's point from earlier as well, that this is just about tax. It's not about employment law. But if you change your business model to engage people as employees because of this, then it is about employment law, because they become actual employees, with everything that entails. I mean, it might be the right option, but you've got to think carefully, because not only are we sitting here talking about massive upheaval in tax, we're in the background lurking there is the biggest, it's called the biggest upheaval in a generation to employment law. It's probably wider than that, including, importantly, the right not to be unfairly dismissed after 6 months.
6 months now,
the proposal, which is, for a site-based construction project, not that long on a decent sized project. So we've suddenly got a whole cohort of employed people who were previously self-employed. After 6 months, they're entitled to not be unfairly dismissed. You've got to look at redundancy payments, and the rules on collective redundancies are changing as well. So it's kind of the squeeze from both sides. So you've got to get this right. You've got to find the sweet spot. Obviously, you've got to be safe. You don't want liabilities suddenly popping up out of the blue that you didn't anticipate. But you also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. As Mark said, there's still a role for intermediaries operating CIS to engage people outside of SDC, if that's the right situation, and they're running those operations in a compliant way, doing the SDC tests, keeping records, and able to demonstrate that they can be paid on a self-employed basis. There's still very much a role for those sort of intermediaries, and you will still be buffered, protected from the employment law position. It's also worth mentioning a new government department that's set to kick off in April as well, called the Fair Work Agency, and that this is going to be kind of an employment rights police, like nothing we've had before. HMRC are out there doing checks and audits on tax, but generally employment rights are for an individual to bring a claim, to instigate. I mean, Mark, you can probably talk with more authority, being an employment lawyer, than I can on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think this is the other side of it in terms of, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and jumping to employment. For now, employment rights are enforced by individuals making claims. So from a business perspective, they're manageable. they don't happen that often, and there's plenty of time to get to the bottom of the claim and reach a resolution with the individual if that's the right thing to do. When the Fair Work Agency kicks in, this will be a government body that can bring claims on individuals' behalf, even if the individual doesn't want to be party to the claim. So, the potential now for individual claims to become whole workforce claims goes up because the Fair Work Agency will be able to say, okay, so we've had a complaint from individual one. We know you've got 50 other individuals employed or engaged in the same way. So we want to look at all of those. And suddenly this one person potential claim becomes a 50 subcontractor strong claim or employee claim. So it's really important that when we talk about your engagement map and working out how you want to do this going forwards, that you focus on the tax rules because they're coming in now and they're big, but don't just focus on those because you might be creating detriments further down the chain as well and in other jurisdictions. So you've got to make sure the advice you're getting can deal with all of those things.
Thank you. I was going to ask about the practical steps then that companies should take to prepare for these changes. Would you say that there would be the possibility of reviewing contracts with umbrella companies, considering in-house payroll options, or investing in staff to ensure that compliance?
Look, there's a number of steps businesses can take, and they'll know internally which ones are right for them based on what they think they can do internally. But I think the first thing to do is get to grips with the new rules, understand them, and understand how they impact your business, and then understand from your engagement map your supply chains, and then beyond that, like I've said, accept now that you have some responsibility under this legislation because you have some potential liability, which means doing some work. It's all eminently doable, but it does mean, businesses maybe have outsourced the recruitment of temporary labour, they've outsourced the payroll of temporary labour, and up until now, they've also outsourced the liability, so they haven't had to worry about it. They can't outsource the liability anymore, so they've got to take some responsibility and do some work. Now, it's eminently doable, and it will involve all the things we've said. So, understanding your engagements, understanding your contracts, taking professional advice on all of that, and then beyond that, monitoring that going forwards. But I think until a business gets to grips with some advice in terms of how they engage their labour and how they want to engage it going forwards, they don't know what the next steps are. But they've got to do that first, and they've got to, like I said, avoid one size fits all because it doesn't. It rarely does, but now it definitely doesn't. Anything else, Matt?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is just backtracking a little bit, actually. We've by necessity had to simplify what we're talking about when we've given the definitions of these, particularly the purported umbrella company, so that a few conditions, and one that I didn't mention that I probably should have done, and that's in the case two, the self-employed scenario. So in the scenario where you've got a client dealing directly with some form of intermediary engaging workers on a self-employed basis, the client is now jointly and severally liable if the intermediary can't show that there's no supervision, direction, and control over the worker. That's not the case where that intermediary found the worker for the client. They provided work finding services. This is one of the little nuances of the legislation, so they're not aiming it at agencies. And some of your sharper attendees today, I'm sure there are many of them, might be thinking, well, isn't that just, an agency could be supplying me self-employed people? Does that mean I'm liable for what's going on there? This is one of the little nuances, and this is why it's really important to understand exactly when you do this engagement map how people are supplied and what the form of engagement is and how it all hangs together. And that's one of the little nuances of the legislation. So as Mark said, you've got to understand it, you've got to understand your supply chains. I think the other thing we'll see is a lot of changes to contracts. We've got to understand what the client thinks, and we've got to make sure it applies right down the supply chain. And if we miss out on something. Could be a clause, could even be, you know, some of the ancillary documentation, induction statements, handbooks that are given out quite freely on site, quite often riddled with terminology like employment. And there's often quite a lot of confusion about how people are engaged as well, particularly by agencies. A lot of people think they're employed because they're PAYE, when it turns out they're not actual employees. They're just PAYE because they're working through an agency. So it's understanding all these little things, putting them all together. Only when you've done that and fully got to grips with it, can you then stand back and say, yeah, we're safe from the problems this legislation might cause.
Thank you. So, as you've both said, it's about understanding your supply chains, accepting the responsibility, looking at your contracts, engagement, and monitoring those as well. Given the complexity of these new regulations, many businesses will need expert advice to ensure they are fully compliant with the expertise in tax and VAT and employment law at Chartergates. How is Chartergates assisting businesses, construction businesses, specifically in preparing for the new legislation? What guidance are you offering on how businesses can ensure compliance and avoid those potential pitfalls related to the changes?
Yeah. Okay. So Matt and I have both been doing this a long time now. I'm advising in these specific issues: tax in the construction industry, employment law in the construction industry, on specific employment status issues for over 25 years. I know Matt doesn't look old enough, but Matt's been doing this for 30 odd years now.
Feel old enough.
So, and I think this is really important because we've seen all the other challenges that have come across and helped construction businesses navigate those. This is new and it's a particularly big challenge, but I think if people are prepared to engage with us and get the work done early, then it's all eminently manageable. So it's all about, we can provide the advice, the education, look at your documents, audit your supply chain on an ongoing basis, redraft your documents if you need, and if it comes to the point where you need representation, then we can do that as well. And I think it's up to businesses to decide how much assistance and how much they want from us. So that can be a meeting to just go through these things, and then they might have an in-house team. They think we've got this now, thanks for that. All the way through to we can manage the supply chain for them, ensuring compliance all the way through the supply chain. But it's about businesses taking that first step, understanding how they engage labour, and then, well, we can help them do that, but then going from there in terms of what they need. Anything else, Matt?
No, I think that's perfect.
Thank you. Well, that's all the questions that I have. I do have a couple of questions that have come in through on the chat and also by email. One of them is if a contractor has structured its CIS labour model correctly, with proper contractual arrangements and genuine independent status and practice, is it fair to say that there should be no joint and several liability exposure? And also, on the back of that, would you recommend an independent audit process such as RISC to evidence everything and ensure reasonable care?
Okay. Want to do with the first bit?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a really great question. We've touched on it a little bit, but as Mark said earlier, if there's no liability, there's no joint and several liability. And there is definitely a role for self-employed intermediaries to engage workers compliantly on behalf of construction companies. There's no problem at all with that. This legislation doesn't create any new liability in that situation. So if there's no liability today, there won't be any liability on the 6th of April. What it does do is say, if there's a problem and everyone's ignoring it, then there's joint and several liability. So it's all about compliance, Danielle. If you're doing it right, and you should be doing it right anyway, because otherwise somebody's going to have a problem, there is going to be a bill to pay. You should be doing it right anyway. I suppose the silver lining to this cloud is everyone's got to sharpen their toolbox now. Maybe the rule about SDC has been in for a long time. We haven't actually seen any cases on it. So maybe a little bit of complacency has set in some quarters. if that's the case, it is time now to refocus on it and say, okay, what do we need to do? So if the revenue knock on the door tomorrow, we can say, yeah, there's no SDC, we can pass the test. Here's all our documentation. Here's our contracts, and it's been done with it's been done rigorously and it's been done properly. In that case, no problems at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of auditing your supply chain, that's going to be really, really important. First of all, like I said, you've got to understand your supply chain. Then it's about speaking with your suppliers in terms of what are they saying to you about the legislation? Do they understand the legislation? And are you comfortable they can deal with it? And one of the ways you get comfortable is by auditing them, but also ensuring your internal practices match up with what the supplier is doing. Because if the supplier is doing everything correctly their end, but the construction business, let's say at the top of the chain, isn't, then the construction business is suddenly creating a problem for itself. And there's not much the supplier can do about that. So it's about making sure the whole supply chain are on all fours in terms of what they want to happen and that it can happen within the bounds of what happens in practice and in the documents. And you've got to audit all of that.
Thank you. I know we're running slightly over now, but I have 2 questions. If you could possibly answer these relatively quickly. So the first one, thank you.
We charge by the hour though, Danielle. That's the problem.
That doesn't surprise me. So the first one is, does this apply to subcontracting work, for example, package works involving more than just labour? And the second question is, how can end users put indemnity clauses in place if we are all liable? Can they override this new legislation?
Okay, shall I deal with the indemnities one?
Okay.
We'll start with the second question. In terms of indemnities, you can put an indemnity in place. It can't override the legislation, so the liability will still go where the liability goes based on the legislation, and then the beneficiary of an indemnity clause will then need to enforce that. So they'll get a bill, and then they'll have to enforce that. Now, as Matt said, the problem with this is if there is tax owing and the supplier can't pay it, what are the chances they can pay the indemnity clause? So they are, as Matt said, I think they are a good guide and they can be used to keep suppliers on their toes, that, there is this indemnity clause there, but on its own, it's not going to be enough to allow a construction business to feel like they've got compliance. If your only defense is, well, if something goes wrong, we can push the bill onto someone else, that's probably a good indication that something's going to go wrong. And then you've got to hope they're there to pay the bill.
Yeah, the first part of that question, Danielle, the short answer is no. This is a labour supply measure. So the client is where the labour supply ends. I'll just caveat that by saying you've got to be very careful when you talk about subcontracted works to look at what the contract says. Sometimes it is a contract for labour supply, so the detail's important. But for the most part and the obvious part, if you are subcontracting the work out to somebody else as a package, they're responsible for all the works. They're probably the client, because then they're going to go and find the labour for it. So short answer, no, but be careful.
Yeah, I think you can't dress up labour supply as a service and expect that to hold. It's got to be the actual provision of a service.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for your insights today, for both your insights. And before we conclude, is there anything else you'd like to add, or any final thoughts?
I'd just like to say thank you for giving us this opportunity. It's been really good. Really enjoyed it.
Oh, no, appreciate it.
Any questions that arise after, we'll be happy to help out. So just ping them over to us, Danielle.
Definitely, thank you. Appreciate, again, thanks for your time and your expertise. That does conclude our discussion on this Chartergates sponsored webinar. Our thanks to the team at Chartergates and to yourself, Mark and Matt. And thanks to everyone watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Cheers,
Thank you, Danielle.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.